Hello there, I'm Brian Musser. I'm the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power. The peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world around you. And we are looking at the good news. The gospel is good news for every person in every part of life. And each week we've been talking about a current relevant issue and how the gospel relates to it through these 5 question areas: relationships, lifestyle, purpose, belonging, and beliefs. And some of these current issues in our introductory week, we talked about racism and social justice. We talked about the idea of how we respond to COVID. We talked about the gospel and the environment. Last week we handled the weighty subject of the gospel and suicide. And if any of these topics interest you, you can find them on my YouTube channel, on my WordPress blog. Just look for the videos, they're posted there. This week, and we're talking about current relevant issues, and there is nothing more current than November 7th to be talking about politics and how the gospel connects to politics and the sense of belonging, the sense of hospitality. And there are just some very interesting ways the gospel teaches us as Christians to engage in the political world. I'm going to be rather blunt with some of these things, and some of these images are not mine. I've pulled them off the internet, so they might disappear after a while. But in politics, we create this sense of us versus them. And what we try to do is we try to, with those we define as us, we try to define us in such a way that all the goodness, all the good qualities are in and among us, and all the bad qualities over there are evil and are with them. We do this as Christians, we do this as Americans, we do this as Republicans or Democrats. We focus and try to organize the descriptions about our life around the ideas of us being good and them being evil. And we clearly mark these different things. And then we start pointing to the faults in others and looking at the good qualities in us. But that's not necessarily how the gospel should think of things. How does the church, how does the gospel connect to politics? What is the gospel's role in a divided world? What are we doing through this? Well, if you look at it, you got to think the biggest divide ever in this world was the divide between the holy divinity and the unholy, sinful humanity. We separated ourselves from God. And if there was any sort of us versus them that was legitimate, it was the us of the Trinity versus the them of humanity. We sinned. We separated ourselves from God. We were evil. God was good. And if God was human, God would have said, you know what? I want to distance myself from them. I want to separate myself from them. I don't want the stink of their sin getting on me. I am going to let them continue to be separated from me and go to hell is basically what God could have done. And God would have been just to allow that. But that's not what God did. Through Jesus Christ, God invested in humanity. God became one of us and put God's self in the midst of the human misery, in the midst of the human problems, in the midst of human sinfulness. Although never sinning, God became sin for us. God took the sin of humanity onto God's self and became our sin, so that the wrath of God could be separated from humanity, so that humanity could be reconnected with God through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now think about that. Jesus died for sinners while we were the enemies of God. That is our example. That is our model. That is what Christ means to us. So, considering that, that is who we should emulate. That is what life is. If there are those who we seem to think are the enemies, our enemies. Now, I'm not so sure we should have them. But even if we do, even if there are enemies of the gospel, even if there are enemies of God, even if there are enemies of the church and Christianity, what would Christ do in that situation? Christ died for them. Christ died for the enemies of God. And if Christ is our example, we should be willing to sacrifice ourselves for the other. So whatever separates us, whether it's politics, whether it's something as silly enough as football teams, we should be willing to sacrifice ourselves in the image of Christ for the others. That is the gospel. Jesus died for us while we were the enemies of God, and we need to be willing to sacrifice ourselves for not only our friends, but for others. Watchman Nee writes in a book this story about how this Chinese farmer, and they were tiered, had this irrigation system for his farm. But his neighbor who lived under him kept digging a hole in his irrigation system and draining all the water out of his fields into his own. The one farmer had fields on the hill lower than the first farmer. So this Christian farmer who had the upper field that was getting drained all the time goes to his Christian brothers and sisters and complains. He's like, is this just? Is this right that this person keeps draining the water off of my field for his own? And his brothers and sisters says, it is not right. But if we merely only choose what is right and what is just, we are very poor Christians. We do not choose justice, but love in this situation. They suggested the farmer go back and fill the irrigation system of his neighbor first and then fill his own to serve his neighbor. Serve the neighbor that was committing an offense against him. That's what the Christian brothers and sisters in that Chinese church suggested the farmer do. He did that. It shocked his neighbor and made his neighbor curious about the gospel, about why somebody would do this when he was purposefully destroying his irrigation system. Eventually, that neighbor becomes a Christian. Serving those who are even offending us is the gospel lived out in our lives. So, in politics, if you're a Republican, how do you serve a Democrat? If you're a Democrat, how do you love a Republican? If you are from one of the groups that gets mentioned so often that is at odds with another group, us versus them, if that is part of your identity, you are an us and they are the them, how do you love that person across the table from you that you have trouble even talking to? That is the way of Christ. That is what we are about as Christians. That is the gospel in politics. You can join this conversation live Monday nights, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time via Zoom, these weekly wrap-ups on YouTube and WordPress. There is a special event this Monday, Monday 11/9, November 9th at 2 p.m. via Zoom. The details are there. Time management is spiritual, using our spiritual beliefs to make time management decisions. But if you can't make this, it will be posted as well in a wrap-up sort of form. And as always, I am all over social media, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, and YouTube. Those links are in the description. Thank you for joining me and hope to see you again real soon.